Pride and Prejudice is a 2005 romantic drama starring Keira Knightley as Elizabeth Bennet and Matthew Macfadyen as Mr. Darcy. The film is based on the 1813 novel Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, one of her several popular novels dealing with British social classes, gender, and societal norms of the time, as well as familial and romantic relationships. An Anglo-American collaboration between British and American studios, the film brings audiences back to a distant British past, focusing on human nature rather than the visual spectacle of so many British heritage films. It captures the hearts of viewers, both British and American, in distinct ways one may not expect. Pride and Prejudice use of British setting, actors, and cultural and historical values such as understatement and literature make this film British. Set during the late 18th century, Mr. and Mrs. Bennet and their daughters Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Kitty, and Lydia live in Longbourn, England. Mrs. Bennet is eager to set up marriages for her daughters. Charles Bingley, a wealthy bachelor, moves into nearby Netherfield. Bringing his jaded friend Mr. Darcy, Darcy and Elizabeth both exhibit pride and have their own prejudices of class and each other. After many miscommunications and obstacles, they profess their love for each other and in the end realize they were wrong.
So what makes this film British? For one, the film is directed by British director Joe Wright and written for the screen by British screenwriter Deborah McGough. It has a cast full of British actors and British crew with only a few American actors and crew members. Even if part of the money is coming from America, one of the most important aspects of the film is the location and stylistic choices made by the British director. As we talked about in class, one of Britain's biggest exports is their history and famous literature, i.e. Jane Austen. Location is an important part of the film. While most of the time we stay on medium and medium close-up shots, there is the occasional shot of landscape showing off the beautiful hills and landscapes of the UK. Because it is a film that takes place in the past, many might argue that it is a heritage film. Heritage films are typically portrayals of the past that tend to focus on luxurious settings, garments, and more. They bring attention to the lifestyles of the aristocracy rather than the poorer classes, and display the past as a lavish consumer experience, presenting it as spectacle for the audiences, rather than offering audiences any historical or critical understanding. We can see this in films like Queen Victoria or Belle, but in Pride and Prejudice, Jane Austen brings our attention to the divides between the classes. In the film, there are moments of the classic heritage on display, like at Darcy's mansion or Mr. Darcy's aunt's house, where we can see some of the lavish decor and apparent lifestyle. But it is mostly there to make a commentary on the divide between the classes, and in this case, as Jane Austen shows us, the upper classes, although dwelling in luxury, often seem lonely and cold within those walls. The camera seems to care more about watching the characters within these settings rather than the settings themselves. The cinematography highlights the life of both classes, and it seems that the lower classes, while maybe less refined, actually have more life and vibrancy, the very thing that ends up drawing in the men from the quote-unquote superior births. British director Wright also adds his Britishness to the film in several ways, one of which characteristic of British culture and identity is the value of understatement. When looking at American films, narrative structure, popular sentiments, and culture, it is clear that American cinema tends to rely and pull on emotion, dramatizing events, climactic scenes, endings, romance, and more. But when looking at British cinema, we tend to see the opposite. British culture and identity tend to value understatement, interpreting great meaning from a little detail, looking at what is unsaid rather than said, leaving things up to the imagination rather than spelling it out, to name a few examples. To overdo emotion, drama, dialogue, or anything else can quickly become too much for British audiences. This is not to say that emotion and drama are detestable or unseen in British cinema, but rather that they are used sparingly and tastefully. Understatement is in some ways part of the backbone of the film when it comes to narrative, dialogue, and what is seen versus what is unseen within the characters on screen. The camera lives out of sight and mind, observing the actions of the characters on screen. The understatement is once again seen in many of the characters' body language, dialogue, and acting. For example, the characters in the film that become quite irritating are the mother and two youngest daughters of the Bennet family. And what are the traits that separate them and add to their annoying nature? One could argue it is their tendency for extreme emotions, outbursts, and obsession with love and marriage, while most of the other characters, including Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth, stay reserved, have self-control, and express their deeper emotions more sparingly. One of the most notable ways understatement comes out is in the romance of the film. Romance and connection, being one of the main motives for the story, is in itself understated throughout the entirety of the film for the most part. There are, however, several instances where more dramatic and Americanized feeling scenes are present, like, for example, the scene in the rain where Darcy and Elizabeth fight. Pride and Prejudice is not some cheap, passion-filled rom-com, but a carefully laid out and very, very slow-paced shifting of character for each of our protagonists. There are tiny glimpses here and there of a romance blooming, small exchanges, conversations, subtle looks and glances, the touch of a hand, and at the end, a slow striding towards Elizabeth in an open field. And once he arrives, a few lines of dialogue, your hands are cold, a small kiss of the hand, and then
a small forehead kiss.
This isn't the climactic love embrace most American viewers would expect. Not even a kiss. It goes to show that value of understatement and reservation that gives the scene its ultimate power and causes the audience to lean in even more. This will transition us into the last part of this video essay where we will talk about the ending. When screening the film to British audiences, Wright had created an alternate ending, one where, after receiving the father's consent for marriage, the audience gets to see the couple alone in a more intimate setting, showing their affection with sweet dialogue and, you guessed it, a kiss. But wait, it's not one, not two, but 4 kisses. When this version of the ending was shown to British test audiences, most of them disapproved, saying it was too sugary and inconsistent with Jane Austen's work. Some audience members reportedly thought it comedic and far too much. Most Americans have seen this version, but don't realize the original ends with the exchange between Lizzie and her father, the final shot being her father saying the line, "I am quite at my leisure," chuckling to himself and then cutting to black. This ending might feel incomplete to American audiences more often used to endings tied up with bows or at least a kiss. But this is one of the most distinctly British features of the film, and the fact that a separate version was made specifically for American audiences goes to show there is indeed a difference between a British ending and an American ending. Now that we've covered it is a British film, how British is it? We'd like to argue it is a 3 out of 5 biscuits on the scale of Britishness. You may be wondering, why is it not more British? Although we stated this film does not make use of understatement. What? Although we stated that this film does make a use of understatement and is written, directed, and performed with British people, there is still more modern and American-influenced quality about it. There is still a more modern and American-influenced quality about it compared to films that we may consider more British. It is not a traditional heritage film, but not a full-blown romantic comedy either. It is somewhere in between, infused with key parts of British culture and identity, but also with a more modern and American feel. Director Joe Wright purportedly drew inspiration from some American films during the creation of this film. So we know there was a sense of American influence in the making of this film, most likely surrounding the romance of the narrative. While for the most part the film stays consistent with the novel, it is not exactly the same. Despite this film being produced by both British and American production companies and containing both British and American talent on screen, it does, however, remain distinctly British through aesthetic and stylistic choices, its use of understatement, and in the ways the original version pushes against most Hollywood norms. There are films that could be considered more British than this, but Pride and Prejudice use of British setting, actors, and cultural and historical values such as understatement and literature make this film British.